Contents of a Dead Man's Pocket, Part 2. To simply go out and get his paper was an easy task. He could be back here with it in less than 2 minutes, and he knew he wasn't deceiving himself. The ledge, he saw measuring it with his eye, was about as wide as the length of his shoe and perfectly flat, and every fifth row of brick in the face of the building he remembered leaning out. He verified this was indented half an inch, enough for the tips of his fingers, enough to maintain balance easily. It occurred to him that if this ledge and wall were only a yard above ground, as he knelt at the window, staring out, this thought, final confirmation of his intention, he could move along the ledge indefinitely. On a sudden impulse, he got to his feet, walked to the front closet, took out an old tweed jacket. It would be cold outside. He put it on, buttoned it, as he crossed the room rapidly toward the open window. In the back of his mind, he knew he'd better hurry and get this over with before he thought too much. And at the window, he didn't allow himself to hesitate. He swung a leg over the sill, then felt for it, and found the ledge a yard below the window with his foot. Gripping the bottom of the window frame very tightly and carefully, he slowly ducked his head under it. Feeling on his face the sudden change from the warm air of the room to the chill outside, with infinite care he brought out his other leg, his mind concentrating on what he was doing. Then he slowly stood erect. Most of the putty, dried out and brittle, had dropped off the bottom edging of the window frame, and he found and the flat wooden edging provided a good gripping surface, a half inch or more deep for the tips of his fingers. Now, balanced easily and firmly, he stood on the ledge outside in a slight chill breeze, 11 stories above the street, staring into his own lighted apartment, odd and different seeming now. First his right hand, then his left. He carefully shifted his fingertip grip from the puttyless window edging to an indented row of bricks directly to his right. It was hard to take the first shuffling sideways step, then to make himself move, and the fear stirred in his stomach. But he did it, again, by not allowing himself time to think. And now, with his chest, stomach, and the left side of his face pressed against the rough, cold brick, his lighted apartment was suddenly gone, and it was much darker out here than he had thought. Without pause, he continued, right foot, right foot, left, his shoe soles shuffling and scraping along the rough stone, never lifting from it. Fingers sliding along the exposed edging of brick, he moved on the balls of his feet, heels lifted slightly. The ledge was not quite as wide as we'd expected, but leaning slightly inward toward the face of the building and pressed against it, he could feel his balance firm and secure, and moving along the ledge was quite as easy as he had thought it would be. He could hear the buttons of his jacket scraping steadily along the rough bricks and feel them catch momentarily, tugging a little at each mortared crack. He simply did not permit himself to look down, though the compulsion to do so never left him, nor did he allow himself actually to think mechanically, right foot, left foot, over and over again. He shuffled along crabwise, watching the projecting wall ahead loom steadily closer. Then he reached, and at the corner, he decided how he was going to pick up the paper. He lifted his right foot and placed it carefully on the ledge that ran along the projecting wall at the right angle to the ledge on which his other foot rested. And now, facing the building, he stood in a corner formed by the two walls, one foot on the ledge of each, a hand on the shoulder-high indentation of each wall. His forehead was pressed directly into the corner against the cold bricks, and now he carefully lowered first one hand, then the other, perhaps a foot farther down, to the next indentation in the row of bricks, very slowly sliding his forehead down the trough of the brick corner, and bending his knees, he lowered his body toward the paper lying between his outstretched feet. Again he lowered his finger holds, another foot, and bent his knees still more, thigh muscles taut, his forehead sliding and bumping down the brick V. Half squatting now, he dropped his left hand to the next indentation and then slowly reached with his right hand toward the paper between his feet. He couldn't quite touch it, and his knees now were pressed against the wall. He could bend them no farther, but by ducking his head another inch lower, the top of his head now pressed against the bricks. He lowered his right shoulder, and his fingers had the paper by a corner, pulling it loose. At the same instant, he saw between his legs, and far below Lexington Avenue stretched out for miles ahead. He saw in that instant the Lowe's Theater sign. Blocks ahead, past 50th Street, miles of traffic signals, all green now, lights of cars, street lamps, countless neon signs, and the moving black dots of people. And a violent, instantaneous explosion of absolute terror roared through him. For a motionless instant, he saw himself externally bent back practically double, balanced on this narrow ledge, nearly half his body projecting out above the street far below. And he began to tremble violently, panic flaring through his mind and muscles. And he felt the blood rush from the surface of his skin. In this fractional moment, before horror paralyzed him, as he stared between his legs at that terrible length of street far beneath him, a fragment of his mind raised his body in a spasmodic jerk to an upright position again, but so violently that his head scraped hard against the wall, bouncing off it, and his body swayed outward to the knife edge of balance, and he very nearly plunged backward and fell. Then he was leaning far into the corner again, squeezing and pushing into it, not only his face, but his chest and stomach, his back arching, and his fingertips clung with all the pressure of his pulling arms to the shoulder-high half-inch indentation in the bricks. He was more than trembling now. His body was racked with a violent shuddering beyond control. His eyes squeezed so tightly shut, it was painful, though he was past awareness of that. His teeth were exposed in a frozen grimace, the strength draining like water from his knees and calves. It was extremely likely he knew that he would faint, slump down along the wall, his face scraping, and then drop backward, a limp weight out into nothing. And to save his life, he concentrated on holding on to consciousness, drawing deliberate deep breaths of cold air into his lungs, fighting to keep his senses aware. Then he knew that he would not faint, but he could not stop shaking nor open his eyes. He stood where his breathing deeply, trying to hold back the terror of the glimpse he had of what lay below him. And he knew he had made a mistake in not making himself stare down at the street, getting used to it and accepting it when he had first stepped out onto the ledge. It was impossible to walk back. He simply could not do it. He couldn't bring himself to make the slightest movement. His strength was gone from his legs, his shivering hands, numb, cold, and desperately rigid, had lost all deftness. His easy ability to move and balance was gone with a step or two. If he had tried to move, he knew that he would stumble clumsily and fall. Seconds passed, with the chill faint when pressing the side of his face, and he could hear the toned down volume of the street traffic far beneath him. Again and again it slowed and then stopped, almost to silence. Then presently, even this high, he could hear the click of the traffic signals and the subdued roar of the cars starting up again. During a lull in the street sounds, he called. Then he was shouting help, so loudly it rasped his throat. But he felt the steady pressure of the wind moving between his face and the blank wall snatch up his cries as he uttered them, and he knew they must sound directionless and distant. And he remembered how habitually here in New York he himself heard and ignored shouts in the night. If anyone heard him, there was no sign of it. And presently, Tom Benecke knew he had to try moving. There was nothing else he could do. Eyes squeezed shut. He watched scenes in his mind like scraps of motion picture. He could not stop them. He saw himself stumbling suddenly sideways as he crept along the ledge. He saw his upper body arc outward, arms flailing. He saw a dangling shoestring caught between the ledge and the sole of his other shoe. Saw a foot start to move, to be stopped with a jerk, and he felt his balance leaving him. He saw himself falling with a terrible speed as his body revolved in the air. Knees clutched tight to his chest, eyes squeezed shut, moaning softly. Out of utter necessity, knowing that any of these thoughts might be reality in a very few seconds, he was slowly able to shut his mind against every thought. But what he now began to do, with fear-soaked slowness, he slid his left foot an inch or two toward his own impossibly distant window. Then He slid the fingers of his shivering left hand a corresponding distance. For a moment he could not bring himself to lift his right foot from one ledge to the other. Then he did it, and he became aware of the harsh exhalation of the air from his throat and realized that he was panting. As his right hand then began to slide along the bridge edging, he was astonished to feel the yellow paper pressed to the bricks underneath his stiff fingers, and he uttered a terrible abrupt bark that might have been a laugh or a moan. He opened his mouth and took the paper in his teeth, pulling it out from under his fingers. By a kind of trick, by concentrating his entire mind on his left foot, then on his left hand, then the other foot, then the other hand, he was able to move, almost imperceptibly, trembling steadily, very nearly without thought. But he could feel the terrible strength of the pent-up horror on just the other side of the flimsy barrier he had erected in his mind, and he knew that if it broke through, he would lose this thin artificial control of his body. During one slow step, he tried keeping his eyes closed. It made him feel safer, shutting him off a little while from a fearful reality of where he was. Then a sudden rush of giddiness swept over him, and he had to open his eyes wide, staring sideways at the cold, rough brick and angled lines of mortar, his cheek tight against the building. He kept his eyes open, then, knowing that if once let him flick outward to stare for an instant at the lighted windows across the street, he would be past help. He didn't know how many dozens of tidy, sidling steps he had taken. His chest, belly, and face pressed to the wall, but he knew the slender hold he was keeping on his mind and body was going to break. He had a sudden mental picture of his apartment on just the other side of this wall, warm, cheerful, incredibly spacious, and he saw himself striding through it, lying down on the floor on his back, arms spread wide, reveling in its unbelievable security. The impossible remoteness of this utter safety, the contrast between it and where he now stood, was more than he could bear, and the barrier broke then, and the fear of the awful height he stood on coursed through his nerves and muscles.